Hi guys, my name is Emily. Welcome to another Top 5 Wednesday. Top 5 Wednesdays were created by Lainey from Ginger Reads Lainey and are currently hosted by Sam from Thoughts on Tomes. Links to everything will be in the description box down below. Today should be April 19th, and today I'm supposed to talk about my favorite LGBTQIA+ characters, authors, books, etc. The first book that I have read that I really do enjoy is a recent read, and that is The Lottery's +1 by Emma Donoghue. Now, this is a piece of literature marketed towards 9 to 12-year-olds. It follows Sumac Lottery and looks at her very large family. So the premise here is that two queer couples, so a gay couple and a lesbian couple, decide to come together and co-parent biological and adopted children. They are multiracial, multilingual, homeschooled, environmentalists, vegan, vegetarian-ish, and the book really kicks off when Sumac's father, nicknamed Popcorn, has to bring his conservative Irish father from his home in the Yukon to live in their house in Toronto with this family who is just open and diverse in all of the ways. And so to have this man being incredibly rude within the safe space of their home is hard for Sumac. There's learning on both sides that has to happen, and it's a really beautiful piece of middle grade fiction. I love this because it is specifically targeted towards middle grade students. I think that we often think that children don't understand things and that children won't be able to handle stuff like this, but I think that's doing them a huge disservice. Children are incredibly malleable and open-minded, and so to present a child with a narrative like this in which you see so much diversity represented, I think is really, really important. And I know there is some controversy on Goodreads about this book being gimmicky, and I do have a review for this coming up where I address this more in depth. I think this is a really important piece of literature for young people. So that is why it makes the Top 5 Wednesday portion of this list of favorite LGBTQIA+ reads. Then I have Simon vs. the Homo Sapiens by Becky Albertali. So this, again, is a piece of queer literature. It is for teens. It's in our 13+ category. So it follows Simon, who is a gay young man who is not out to his family, his friends, his school. One of his peers sees an exchange of emails between him and a boy called Blue and starts to blackmail Simon. This is actually a really cute contemporary romance between Simon and the boy called Blue. It's a coming out narrative. It is also looking at social media and the effects that social media can have, both positive and negative. And I think this is really important in terms of representing a really cute contemporary YA romance that is gay. At the same time, in my review, which I don't know if it's up yet, I am also critical of the fact that this is another coming out narrative. In my experience with queer narratives, both in film and literature, oftentimes there are a limited range of what queer people can do. They either fulfill the function of the gay best friend, like when the author is writing something, they're like, diversity, check, and they're that kind of queer representation, or it is a coming out narrative, so the whole purpose of the narrative is for this person to come out. We don't really get an after. We don't see them living as an out queer person. And so this is another one of those books that is just another coming out narrative, which has a place and is important, but I think it's also important to see queer people just living as people. In the same way that we would write a fantasy novel about a heterosexual woman who goes on a journey, happens to meet a boy, and then saves the day in the end, I would like to see that with queer characters a lot more often. But I mean, it is a cute story and it does do some good things. The next favorite piece of queer literature that I have is Two Boys Kissing by David Levithan. Levithan is gay. He sort of falls between the two generations that appear in this narrative. So what we have in this narrative is this omnipotent we, and they are the generation of men lost to AIDS in the 80s. And then we have young boys in high school who are into social media, into online dating, going to queer proms. So there's a huge generational gap between the gay community in the 80s and between the gay community in the 2000s. And so Levithan as a human actually sits between those two generations and bridges the gap in this narrative. I really, really enjoyed the narrative bringing these two generations together and acknowledging that huge cultural loss. If you think about how many people were lost to AIDS? How many storytellers, how many narratives are just gone? There is a film called Zero Patients made by a gentleman who lives in Toronto, whose name I'm blanking on, but I will link it on the screen, that looks at the AIDS epidemic and the idea of patient zero and kind of turns it on its head. And that film took many of the queer activists from Toronto and put them in the film, and it stands as this sort of, it stands as this crypt for the queer community at the time, because many of the people that were active in the film died. Like, there is, I believe her name is Mrs. T-Cell, and she sings a song. The filming of that scene actually had to be put off because she was so sick that she couldn't perform that day, so they performed it the next day and she died shortly after that. If even that one film captures the lives of the people lost in the 80s, you can imagine everybody that wasn't documented in such a archived manner of a film. So I think Levithan does a really good job with this wee narration of acknowledging that trauma and that loss. And it's a beautiful book. And if you are a young person, I would highly recommend that you read it. I think as somebody who's lived through the 80s and who maybe saw it from a more removed perspective, will get a new perspective on that point in time for the queer community. The next book I have here is The Danish Girl by David Ebershoff. So this tells the story of Lily Elbe, the first transgender woman. Lily Elbe was an historical figure, and she sort of disappeared in the dregs of history, the way people sort of do when you have straight white men writing your history books. This is Ebershoff's fictional imagining of what was going on in Lily's mind and how she sort of came to a place where she actually pursued surgery. I did read this a while ago, last summer, I think, and I didn't produce a review for it because I had some hesitation about bringing this narrative to light in such a spectacular way. I think it's an important story to tell, and that's why it's on this list, because I think pulling these figures forward from history into popular culture, into our current mindset, is really important. I think seeing this representation is really, really important. At the same time, in these sort of fantastical, fictionalized reimagining of this life, it's not an Own Voices novel, I'm curious about how Lily would tell her own story and why we would value this fictionalized account of a trans person's journey. There are transgendered people who have written narratives about their transition, but they do not see the same kind of popularity as this did, and this is a fictionalized account. So I was a little bit hesitant to produce a review for this. Like, I think it's doing important things, that's why it's on this list, but I'm also hesitant to hold this up as any sort of prime example of trans literature. So the next author I have here is Jeanette Winterson. Jeanette Winterson is a wonderful, beautiful writer who also happens to be a lesbian, and themes of sexuality and identity appear throughout her works. I've read 3 of them now. I love them. I do have reviews for some of these, and I will link those down below if I can remember. So that is the end of the Top 5 Wednesday portion. Next, I'm going to share with you my LGBTQIA+ TBR. So if you've been following me for a while now, you know that I am working on a sex and YA series. This is proving a little bit difficult because the idea was to combine academic research with YA literature and sort of form an argument on why it's important, why we need it, whatever. That was a really great summary of my thesis, I know. But basically, the idea of the series is to talk about why it's dangerous to censor these texts and why it's important to have these texts accessible. And I wanted to cite examples in these texts. So I realized that I was missing a lot of queer representation, which has led me to seek out a lot of queer literature that I would like to read and sort of expand my knowledge, expand my reading. Let's start with the top of the pile. And that is The Upside of Unrequited by Becky Albertali. So this is a new release. This focuses on a set of twins, Molly and Cassie, who are, if I remember correctly, Korean and fat, and Cassie is a lesbian and is dating a girl, and Molly is sort of left out because she is not dating anyone and sort of excluded from a lot of time with her twin and best friend now. I'm not sure how much this is going to deal with queer content, but my hopes is that this will do what I wanted Simon to do. I talked about how Simon was just another coming out narrative and we didn't get to see queer people being queer people. I hope that with Cassie and her girlfriend, we get to see lesbians just living as lesbians and not having to come out, but like existing in the same way that we get to see heterosexual people existing. So I will let you know how this goes. I also have Will Grayson. I know nothing about Will Grayson other than that John Green and David Levithan wrote it together. There are stickers all over the back of the book where the blurb is, so I can't even read that for you. But my understanding is that there is a queer character in here. I do respect John Green as a sort of pinnacle figure in YA. He sort of gets held up as one of these top YA writers. And so I think it's important to see him coupled with David Levithan. And I'm curious how many people went from this book to David Levithan's other works. Like, if you weren't already seeking out queer literature, could this book and getting to know David Levithan's style push you to pick up more queer literature and read more diversely and think about other people's perspectives other than your own? I don't know, but I'm excited to see what this is all about. The next book I have here is a piece of lesbian fiction. It is Sugar Rush by Julie Burchill, and I just want to point out that it has an explicit content warning on the cover. I've never seen that in YA, so I'm curious, what is so explicit about this book? Is it just because we're going to get some lesbian sex in here and that, you know, it's dangerous because it's lesbian sex? You can totally have heterosexual couples having sex, but you can't have lesbians having sex in YA? I don't know. It remains to be seen, but I am going to read this and update you. The premise here is that 15-year-old Kim is switching schools and makes a new female friend and then sort of develops more than friendly feelings for this person. It's a narrative in which Kim is questioning her sexuality, questioning her identity, so it might be just another coming out narrative, but I'm really curious about the sexually explicit label, and that was one of the motivators for picking this up. Like, what exactly warrants this label? The next book I have here is Empress of the World by Sara Ryan. So again, this is a piece of lesbian fiction. It's about a girl named Nicola who goes to a summer program and falls in love with a girl. Nicola has never had a relationship before this, but she sort of assumed that she would be attracted to guys, and then all of a sudden finds herself attracted to a girl. And again, it's another questioning of identity. This is one that we actually carry in the bookstore that I work with. So when I started this Sex and YA series, I actually looked up a list of gay YA from the gay YA webpage, which I will leave linked down below. And I tried to see how many queer titles we actually carried in our store. And the answer was very few. So part of the motivation for reading this queer literature is to sell it. So when I have teachers come in and ask me, I'm looking for something like diverse and thought-provoking to read to my students, to put in my class library, what do you recommend? I can show them some of these texts and actually sell these things so that we get more copies in our store. So part of the motivation for me picking this up is that we physically have a copy of this in stock in our store. The next book I have here is part of a fantasy series, and that is Half Lost by Sally Green. So I read the first two in the series, Half Bad and Half Wild, when they first came out. There was a lot of hype around Half Bad. It had so much hype at the time. You go to the big YA booktubers, you go back like 4 years now. Oh my god, 4 years. I'm so old. You go back 3 or 4 years and you will see everybody and their mother was reading this thing, and the series just sort of petered out. Nobody talks about this one, but one of my concerns that I brought up in my earlier reviews of Half Wild and Half Bad, we have Nathan questioning his sexuality, we have him romantically interested in a girl, but also sexually attracted to a boy. So at the time, I was concerned about just having another heteronormative ending, like having this series have Nathan question his sexuality, sort of bait readers into hoping for a queer ending, a queer relationship, and then just having him end up with a woman anyways. So I was largely concerned about the queer baiting that could be in this series, and having had time to sit on it and reflect, I realized that talking about it as queer baiting when he ends up with a woman is by erasure. It's completely erasing the fact that people can be bisexual and can be attracted to both men and women, and that is valid. So in reading this, I hope to just see Nathan's journey with his identity, see where things sit at the end, and correct my ways, hopefully, with a final review and perhaps a revision of my thoughts on the first 2 books. So that's why this is on this list. The next book I have here is Under My Skin by A.E. Doolittle. So this follows Min Lee, who is a woman who seems to have it all together, boyfriend, job, etc. The only thing that really bothers her are her body image issues. She sort of tells herself that she has everything worked out, that everything's fine, but then she meets this woman and sort of starts to question whether or not she is the correct pronoun, because so many of the books that I've picked up are focused on sexual identity opposed to gender identity. This book is going to look at gender identity and what that means and questions about transitioning and pronouns, and so I'm excited for this as well. The next book I have here is If I Was Your Girl by Meredith Russo. Now this won the Stonewall Award, so it is an awarded piece of queer literature. This tells the story of a girl who comes to a new high school for a fresh start, and she's making friends and she finds a boy that she likes. The trouble comes from her fear of disclosing to this boy that she is transgender, that at her old school she was known as the transgender person, but now having this fresh start, nobody knew her as anything else, and so they treated her like a girl and they interacted with her like a girl. It's set up like a YA romance from what I understand, and so I am really, really excited for this. The last book I have here is Starcraft by Barbara Dee. Now this is a piece of middle grade fiction. It is targeted towards 9 to 12-year-olds, and this is apparently one of 2 pieces of middle grade fiction with explicitly queer characters. The character herself is a lesbian, because in the Lotteries +1 you have queer parents. Here you actually have a queer character that young readers are able to identify with in terms of being the same age, being in the same grade, doing the same school things, and in this case, that means putting on a production of Romeo and Juliet. Maddie is in 8th grade, and she gets to perform a part in Romeo and Juliet alongside one of her best friends, who is a girl. We have 2 girls playing the romantic couple in Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet. Maddie starts to have feelings for her friend. This is apparently based on Barbara Dee's daughter's experience. So Barbara Dee has a daughter within this age bracket who is out and who was heavily involved in writing this narrative and in developing this narrative for other people her own age. So I am so excited. This is one of those books that we do not carry in the store, like many pieces of queer literature, but if I can start to sell it to people, if I can get them to order in at least 1 copy, because as a chapters employee you can set like sales goals on certain books. If I set this as a sales goal book, perhaps I could get it into the hands of people who really need it. Teachers, young people, parents. Part of my motivation for reading this is to help me better put important and needed texts into the hands of the customers that I'm interacting with. That is my Top 5 Wednesday. That is my LGBTQIA+ TBR. In doing this, I also realized that it's relatively hard to come across characters who are asexual or aromantic. Like, I was hard-pressed to find YA with asexual, aromantic characters. I know Jughead from the Archie comics has been both asexual and aromantic, but I haven't picked up that because with this Sex and YA series, I don't have a lot of time to devote to reading like all of the canon that exists on Jughead. Maybe I can Google and find things that, like, find issues or stories that particularly address his sexuality. By putting this video out here, I hope that if you've read texts, specifically young adult texts, because that's what I'm interested in terms of my Sex and YA series. If you've read young adult literature with fantastic queer representation, leave those recommendations for me. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you again soon. Bye.